Articles 18 and 19 of the United Nations Universal Declaration for Human Rights stipulate the rights of freedom of expression. Article 18 enshrines in it that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. In Article 19, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and this right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive important information and ideas through any media, regardless of frontiers. According to the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, the Congress shall make no law with respect to an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of expression or the press or the right of the people to peacefully assemble for a redress of grievances. And yet, despite these freedoms being enshrined in constitutions and charters, we've seen actions taken on the contrary. The United States government, amongst other governments, has banned the television networks from airing in these countries. Why have they banned channels from Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, Yemen, Iraq, and Iran, and countless other countries' channels? Why is it that these channels are banned from one rule, but other channels are not banned, despite clearly violating certain aspects of the law? We ask, why is it that only one aspect of a narrative, a media narrative, is allowed to be expressed, but not another narrative? Why is this the case? This conference is titled Banned TV Channels, Threats to Journalism and Media Freedom, hosted by IRTVU and streamed by JSCPRESS on YouTube. IRTVU is a registered media organization based and registered in Geneva, Switzerland. And under it is media organizations from multiple continents. Channels are streamed in multiple languages across the world. The Journalist Support Committee, the JSC, is an organization that supports and promotes independent journalism. So please follow us on JSCPRESS on social media platforms. We have an exciting panel of speakers who are passionate about their work and come from a range of backgrounds. Joining us in the studio today is Mr. Peter Ford. Peter Ford is a former British ambassador to Syria and Bahrain. He has also worked for 8 years within the UN as a senior official with the UNRWA based in Jordan. And he is also a frequent commentator on Syria in the international media. Mr. Peter Ford, it's an honor to have you with us.
Thanks very much for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much. It's our pleasure. It's a pleasure. In that introduction, I briefly touched upon the infringement of our basic rights, the freedom of expression. One aspect in which that has played out is the outright banning of media channels. We've also seen examples where journalists who spoke the truth have been suspended from their channels. And beyond these, we've seen examples where speakers, those who present an alternate opinion, are not allowed to present themselves or to give their opinion on such platforms. And I would be very interested and keen to know what your thoughts are about how important the freedom of expression is, what our rights are in this matter, and what can we do in the face of this onslaught of pushing one particular narrative upon us?
Yeah, those were very interesting questions. You know, Western countries used to pride themselves on being champions of freedom of expression. And they used to slam countries like China for controlling expression or banning certain channels. But in the last few years, Western countries have started to behave in that repressive way. It's become really quite shocking. To take one example, in February this year, the Chinese channel CGTV was banned in this country, in Britain. And to justify the ban, the British authorities claimed that CGTN was, quote, ultimately controlled by the Chinese Communist Party, was political and not impartial. When I heard this justification, I almost laughed. It's funny because of the hypocrisy. Because this description fits the BBC World Service, which also depends on the British government. It's very political, and it's certainly not impartial. And I speak with some personal experience here. As you mentioned, I'm an acknowledged expert on Syria, but only once in 6 years have I been invited by the BBC World Service to talk about Syria. Once, at the beginning. And on that occasion, I criticised the UK government narrative. I was never invited back. So nothing could be more political or less impartial than the BBC World Service. Let's be honest, the BBC, in the shape particularly of the World Service, is a naked propaganda tool. So to accuse China of making television propaganda when we, the British, do the same, only with a much wider audience worldwide, it's ridiculous. And then the British authorities are very selective in which channels they want to control. What about Al Jazeera? Al Jazeera is a propaganda tool for the government of the state of Qatar. A propaganda tool, pure and simple. But Al Jazeera is never questioned by the British authorities. Why? Because Al Jazeera is careful never to upset Britain or America. And indeed, much of Al Jazeera's output dovetails neatly with American and British foreign policy objectives, for example, in pumping out propaganda all the time against Syria. Al Jazeera also supported the regime change in Libya, masterminded by the Western powers. Okay, Al Jazeera sometimes gives a little bit of support to the Palestinians, but never mind. This doesn't matter so much to Britain and America as long as Al Jazeera is not attacking them. They don't like it. They don't like Al Jazeera to attack Israel, but they go along with it because on the really important things, Al Jazeera is with the Western powers. I mentioned Chinese TV having been banned, but short of actual banning, some other channels have been tightly controlled. RT is a particular example, which is, of course, a Russian channel, as everyone knows. And the British television authorities have been constantly disciplining, repressing, trying to control what RT say, accusing them of lack of impartiality. But they don't actually ban RT. So why the difference? Why ban the Chinese but not the Russian channel? And is it possibly because they care so much about freedom of expression? I don't think so. Is it because they're afraid it would look hypocritical when the British media is pumping out propaganda on national security issues 24 hours a day? No, it's simply because Russia is powerful. Russia, if RT was banned, I'm pretty sure that Russia would retaliate by banning all British media in Russia. And this is important to British authorities because they like to be able to use their propaganda tools inside Russia. And for this reason, they have refrained from actually banning RT. Press TV have suffered also, not just at the hands of the British authorities, but also at the hands of the Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, because of their content, which these American international internet giants don't appreciate. It's truly frightening, Hassan, what power these big international giants of the internet have. They may not be arms of American intelligence, but they behave as though they were. Maybe they're not paid to do that, but in effect, they act as propaganda arms of Western governments. Satellite operators have also been drawn into this by the Western powers. Not long ago, the Lebanese channel Al Manar was pulled off EU airwaves by being kicked off a satellite, allegedly because, or apparently, because the operating company was afraid of American sanctions. So there are many ways in which this banning and controlling and censorship operates. Sometimes it's very blatant, other times it's a bit more hidden, but it's definitely very effective. Sometimes Western spokesmen claim that they repress because these foreign channels are interfering in our elections. That is a transparent joke. When we interfere or try to interfere constantly in just about every election everywhere in the world, and the idea that Russia or China could seriously influence the outcome of an election in a Western country is laughable. But nevertheless, recently the British government announced that it was giving $10 million more extra money to the BBC World Service to combat disinformation. I really laughed when I heard this. To combat. The British World Service itself is a primary producer of disinformation. For example, over Syria's alleged use of chemical weapons. The BBC World Service brings in program after program pumping out this propaganda about alleged atrocities in Syria. And to give money to this organization, the BBC World Service, to combat disinformation is the height of hypocrisy. As you mentioned, these controlling behaviors are part of a bigger picture. It's not just television stations being banned, but there's over the whole of media, including print media in the West, there is less and less tolerance for dissidents. I'm not talking just about foreign policy issues here, but even though this control does happen, especially for critics of British Middle East policy, and it happens largely not by putting us in prison, that would be too blatant, but simply by silencing us, by not allowing us a platform on mainstream media, or whether it's television, radio, or print. We are simply excluded. Our voice is not heard, but it's still repression. And it's not just foreign policy issues, it's domestic issues as well. But now, you may have noticed in the last year, there is some overlap, new overlap between national security and what they've started to call biosecurity. And the same state security agencies are involved in both in quite a scary way, so that now it's impossible to have an open discussion about some health issues, about the safety of vaccines, for example, or the usefulness of lockdowns. You cannot have a discussion on these subjects. It is simply suppressed. And health is now a no-go area for open discussion. I nearly finished these opening remarks, but I think you asked, Hassan, why do Western governments do this? Well, there are many answers, and I'm sure we'll touch on other aspects, but they do it because they can, essentially. Because there is no opposition anymore in Britain anyway. It used to be the case, like 20, 30 years ago, that there would always at least be some Labour MPs who were opposing conservative foreign policy, or some dissident Labour MP, a Tony Benn, for example, who would speak up to oppose NATO, something like that. Today there is nothing and nobody in the mainstream political parties who will defend objectivity, question the government seriously, go against the stifling consensus. There is no opposition anymore. Our democracy is under threat because there is no opposition on key issues of national security, including biosecurity. So that's part of the answer. The governments do it because they can get away with it. Nobody is going to hold them to account. And finally, personally, I see this whole phenomenon of repression as part of the infantilization of Western societies, the way ordinary people are treated like infants, like children. And they've grown to like it. People in this country, Britain, have, over the last year especially, they have grown to love the nanny state, as we call it, the nanny state, which protects them, gives them security. And they have forgotten about freedom. We've made a kind of exchange, security for freedom. We're more concerned with security, so governments can do whatever they want in the name of national security. I could go on, but I'm sure we'll go deeper into some of these questions.
Thank you so much. You raised many excellent points regarding how us as the British public have more or less, many have accepted the status quo because of the narrative that is fed, that it is for security and so on. And so it's come to a point that we're, as you said, willing to exchange our freedom, something that you thought would be unheard of not long ago, if something like this was to come up. And no question, through the media, it's something that's progressively come over the years. It's not something that they would have dropped at once. And to touch upon this and more, I would like to bring in our guest who is joining us on Skype. Dr. Jan Oberg, I believe, should be with us.
I'm here.
Dr. Jan Oberg is, just to introduce him for everyone, he is the director of the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research in Sweden, and he is a professor of peace studies, conflict analyst, mediator, and commentator, having promoted peaceful conflict resolution in some 20 hotspots since the 1990s and has taught at many universities. So, Dr. Jan Oberg, you must have heard some of what Mr. Peter Ford was discussing regarding how politics plays a part in this. It's not simply a case of, we disagree with you, but for example, we saw in the case of Russia today, where it's not banned because of the power that that Russia has. And as someone who has had an involvement in conflict resolution and mediating between countries. What do you make of the right to freedom of expression in the media, the conflict that exists between pushing the narrative and pursuing the narrative, and what factors are involved in terms of which media narratives get pushed and which ones get sidelined and so on?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on this program. I am, like Peter said, we are all dissidents nowadays, excluded from the mainstream media because we don't have the right agenda, we don't have the right angles, we need people to have other views than our governments. And so I see the West more and more moving into a situation where, you know, people like us participating in this program and many others, of course, who do have influence on the internet do not have it with the mainstream media. You know, what the mainstream media is acquiring is now a role that resembles Pravda in the Soviet Union. The only difference being at the moment, most people in society do not know that they're lying to us or deceiving us or using fake or what I consider more important, omission. It's the things you are not told, you are not supposed to know. The aspects, the facts, the experts who are never included in the mainstream reporting and the narratives of, let's say, a war like Syria, they'll also have an experience of being totally excluded from the media. And my foundation has just published a report which debunks completely the so-called documentation underlying the accusation that China is responsible for a genocide in the Xinjiang province. We're not saying that we know what it is, we just say the most authoritative report on this does not hold water. So that has been completely disregarded by every single Western media, also those I have personally written to, whereas it has gone viral all over the place outside the West. It's a very interesting and as interesting as tragic development. So when it comes to peace and conflict resolution, I would say, let's imagine you have a complex thing like the dissolution wars of Yugoslavia with 30, 40 participants, not just 6 republics, but much, much more. And you only hear one perspective. You only hear one story. You only interview some experts, never the others. You only monitor what some participants in the conflicts are saying, not what the others are saying, not what arguments are available, not their fears, not their wishes, not the facts about their history and traumas or whatever they carry. You would not understand a thing of it. You see what I mean? If you cut out important dimensions of a complex conflict, and it has a tendency, namely, to be only monitoring or disseminating to the public what is in our interest that they know, you will, one, deceive people. It is simply either propaganda, deceptive, or lies, or what is worse, it prevents conflict resolution. It usually plays in the hands of those who say, let's intervene, let's bomb the place. We divide everything into the good guys and the bad guys. And of course, we think that a conflict resolution means exterminating, demonizing, excluding the so-called bad guys, those we see as bad guys. And secondly, the fundamental mistake made in almost all media of conflicts is they are about a person on top. If we just get rid of that person in the top, be it Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi or Milosevic or whatever, then it will be fine. I mean, show me the example where that is the case. And so what is behind all this, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I've never been and I will never be, because this is ridiculous for a serious social scientist. What we are approaching is a tremendous influence by what we call, my foundation calls MIMAC. And that is the military-industrial media academic complex. The military-industrial media academic complex, MIMAC. Eisenhower talked it about in his farewell speech in the early 60s, and warned the American society and people that if they did not stop the military-industrial complex, he only had the MIC, not the MIMAC, in his conceptualization of it, it would erode democracy. Now, the man was about, 60 years ahead of time in that statement. It has grown much worse, to such an extent that I would not hesitate to say, as a sociologist, the United States today does not have a military-industrial media academic complex. It is a military-industrial media academic complex. It is a MIMAC. Because the country only seems to thrive on, and that goes with the NATO alliance too, only seems to thrive on confrontation, punishment, threats, sanctions, negative energy, destructive activities, CIA, secret troops, influence of media, etc. Whereas those who are coming up now, the Chinese, think of them what you want, but they have constructive ideas and they have a vision about the world 40, 50 years from now. Biden and Blinken administration does not have any idea about next week. You cannot run the world if that is where you are today. So when it comes to peacemaking, you cannot do it unless you have a fair hearing of all sides. You cannot get anywhere if the media do not tell you what all sides in a conflict, where they stand, why they do what they do. And what we should do when we do conflict resolution is not to condemn anybody. We should look at not the parties, but what stands between the parties. What is the problem between, the West or China or whatever, and then ask ourselves, how can we solve the problem? Not how can we get rid of one of the parties, or how can we put one party down, or something like that. The whole conceptualization of conflict resolution in the Western world is absurd. And it is absurd because the purpose of it is to contribute to a sentiment in the public that war becomes natural. Now we are going to intervene because of human rights, or because women are suppressed, or because, God knows what. All this is fake. Because there's not one conflict we could not have solved by now much better than the wars the West have left behind them in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Syria, Yugoslavia at the time, etc. Now, you have to uphold this, because if you don't uphold it, there cannot be this militarism and this militarist thinking. And my sadness over this, and having seen this over my 40 years plus career in conflict resolution and as a media person, commentator, etc., is this is undermining the West itself. This is the West undermining its own credibility, its own finest values about freedom, freedom of the media, freedom of expression, freedom of all attitudes, opinions to be heard, and then decisions to be made democratically. We are destroying ourselves by this bizarre Pravdaization of the media. And I tell you, the moment I see most of these people, I've written to all the leading people who've written about Xinjiang at CNN, Reuters, The Guardian, Danish and Swedish broadcasting people who've been there, reported from it. I've written a nice letter to them. I have given them our report of 30 pages, which is hundreds of references to why the database, why the facts do not meet scholarly standards. And not one is answering, not even saying, thank you very much, we disagree with you, or thank you very much, we learned something from what you said, or whatever. There's nothing. So the compact silence is today manifest. Whereas if I go back to Yugoslavia, I was used by lots of media around the world, including CNN, to give my conflict analytical views and peacemaking views on it. I was a mediator in the Kosovo-Yugoslav conflict, or Serbian conflict, for 4 years. I knew everybody there. There were a few people who knew it better than I did. You were listened to at that time. Today, it doesn't matter what you know. You're not listened to if you're for peace. The peace discourse has disappeared. When did you last see somebody who talked about peace on any media? And so the main people who are writing about these things are people in their 30s, very young people, many of them not even having a master's, most of them having an education as a general journalist, and they're going into hugely complex things such as Xinjiang, and picking out some people somewhere, and this is the truth about the place. If this is the intellectual level of the Western world, we are going to fall faster than even I have predicted.
That is incredibly. It is a stark warning, ultimately.
Stark warning from both my heart and my brain.
One thing that I have actually wanted to ask you. You mentioned that the acronym that you had, the Military Industrial Media Academic Complex, and how it is almost paraded in the media, the call to war. We see that on several news channels. Quite shocking, if I'm being honest, how no one seems to have anything to say about the fact that they literally threaten war, threatening to kill innocent civilians by saying, send the US to XYZ conflict. So one question that I want to ask is, what do governments, we've talked about media narratives, but what do the governments, or what is in there for them to go in militarily confrontational, as opposed to seeking out a peaceful resolution? What is in there for them in that narrative?
Well, of course, they have interests. The idea of intervening in Syria is bizarre. Has been about oil. It has been about logical problems. It's been about refugees that came in from the war in Iraq and lots of other factors. And then you have to sometimes cover up what are the long-term consequences of what you did in Iraq. Yeah, that spilled over to Syria. But in actual fact, we make the story up that everything can be explained by the activities of Bashar al-Assad, who, after having been president, for 11 years, sits up in bed one morning with his wife and said, I'm going to kill my own people in the millions, I mean, send me the telephone number of a psychologist who can explain that kind of thing. I'm not saying the man is innocent. And I'm not saying the security services, I think there are 8 of them in Syria, are good guys. I'm just saying, I mean, the putting everything on that formula is ridiculous, but it serves interventionism. And secondly, if you ask why this whole thing that I talked about here is increasing these years, I'm not in doubt for a single moment that it has mostly to do with the fact that the United States is declining. The United States today has militarized itself to death. It has basically, like the Soviet Union did at its time, but it had a smaller economy. And Gorbachev was wise enough to say that we have to change this. We cannot build a new system on militarism. And, it has militarized itself to death, but it's also falling in the sense that the strength on all indicators, except the military, the strength of the United States is going down compared with other parts of the world. And of course, economically, technically, education-wise, research-wise, innovation-wise, and vision-wise, losing out already to China. It is this sense of being the grumpy old guy who doesn't understand the world anymore, and the world does not listen to him anymore. And then you get more and more, if you will, aggressive. You get more and more insistent on having your ways. You just take the first speech of Biden, the Congress, saying, we are dreaming again, we are working again, and we are leading the world again. I mean, excuse me, but what world are you living in, sir? You are one among many, and you're not going to lead the future world. The best bet for the United States now, instead of fighting and having competition and undermining and manipulating media vis-a-vis China, would be to cooperate with China if it wants to save its own future. I think it's utterly stupid what the Americans are doing at the moment. And I have never, ever in my life been anti-American. I'm anti-empire and I'm anti-militarism and I'm anti-war. And anybody who does it. I'm a collector of American art. I have been taught a lot by Americans. I work with American scholars every day. I'm not anti-American, but it's very sad to see that it's destroying itself. The United States is not threatened by anybody. It's destroying itself because of the way it handles the fact that in the long run, it will not be an empire anymore and it will not lead the world alone.
It's very interesting that you point out that America has a certain image of itself and the distance between what it perceives itself to be and what perhaps it is in reality. And as well as not coming to terms with the fact, which you said in your own words, losing grip with its power or maybe hegemony, as you may describe. I just wanted to ask you, Peter, regarding, you mentioned as well about the social media and how that has helped in terms of loosening the grip of the media. As someone who has obviously spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and I'm sure has been following recent developments regarding Israel-Palestine, how important would you say has social media, the sharing of social media, raising awareness of what's happened in regarding Israel-Palestine, how important has that been in terms of providing that alternative narrative that the mainstream media would have never shown and the British public would have never known about?
Yeah, the internet is a mixed blessing.
Of course.
I touched on some of the negatives, the control that Facebook and Twitter, all of them are increasingly the grip they're taking on free speech. But this itself is a reflection of the good things about social media, the fact that in recent years information has been traded more openly thanks to the internet and social media. So I think we're at something of a crossroads now with social media. Really, the repression of the last 12 months, particularly on the issue of health security, has really broken certain barriers. Now we have fact checkers who in fact are opinion checkers, already spreading their fact checking to international issues, so it's increasingly hard to express views about Israel-Palestine. But the good thing is that the mainstream channels are terrified of social media. Social media is very flexible. If Facebook go too far, then they will find rivals popping up. This is already happening. There are many ways to circumvent control by the giants. But I'd just like to echo a point made by Jan with his perspective on conflict resolution. This whole issue is not just about how bad it is to control free speech, it's how that translates into increasing conflict. When you don't hear the other side anymore, escalation and intervention become much more likely. So the issue of banning television stations has many profound implications.
Yeah, very much so. As you brought Dr. Jan in, I might as well bring him in as well for a question. You mentioned that you, Jan, have that we were able to have a paper and a document which you presented your research on Xinjiang and the veracity, verifying whether the facts and the data and so on actually hold out, and as you mentioned, whether they are up to any scholarly standard, and how you were effectively not given any response, to be honest, by many of the mainstream media and other media who you tried to approach. So my question to you regarding that is, given that you're not getting a reception from these areas, how best do you see as being able to rectify that, to correct that, to best give justice to the work that you've done, to ensure that what you have, the hard work that you put in, the research that you put in, is shared widely to the general public, and how you're able to tackle the narrative and, most importantly, fight for your cause of peace and ensuring that there are no interventions in future conflict?
course, this is the type of thing I grapple with every day with my colleagues. How do we get through? I would like to say, however, I have a long time ago given up the idea that to change the world, or influence the world, you have to get through the mainstream Western media. If they are not interested, what can you do? We do email services, we do social media quite broadly. We do interviews, commentating, etc. But whereas I was frequently used, for instance, in my own native country, Denmark, in the 90s and onwards, nobody's interested today. So I sit occasionally on Russia Today. I'm a commentator at Press TV, and I have recently done with my colleagues a series of interviews at CGTN and CCTV and reached basically hundreds of millions of people. My attitude has always been, I speak with everyone. I am ready to talk with anybody who wants to listen, who wants to ask me questions. I have no prejudice against any media or journalist or orientation. But if there's no interest, or they have been told by authorities somewhere, most likely in Washington and surroundings, that don't talk to this type of guys, I mean, I'm not going to waste my life on getting through something which is impossible. I am not hurt by it. But the Western world and the liberal culture and the political culture I'm a product of, 70 years old, all that I've been grown up with has been let everybody speak, defend the right of people to disagree with them, and then disagree with them if you want. All this is completely now undermined by the West itself, not by Russia or China or Iran. That's ridiculous. We're destroying our own societies, and that destruction is led by Washington at the moment. I'd like to give you a concrete example. There is now a democratically promoted proposal in the US Congress called S1169. You better learn that by heart, S1169. It is the China Competition Act of 260 pages, and it starts out with an incredible argument that we have now, because of China's influence, to outcompete China. We have everything it does is contrary to the US interests. And they're destroying the international order, and it's a threat to the whole world, the international community, etc. And it puts at risk, you know, the national interest of the US too. So in all fields, the US is now going to put billions of dollars behind, you know, competing with China. I say good luck on a number of including, you know, education and research. But there's one little thing you should be aware of, and which is directly important for what we say here. That is, and I quote, I'm looking a little bit to the side here, that it shall set off, and this is a democratic proposal, it shall set out of $300 million each year, 2022, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That is $1.5 billion to counter the malign Chinese Communist Party influence, including educating, training courses, etc., for journalists to write and highlight the negative aspects of the Belt and Road Initiative. For the Western listeners here who may not know what the Belt and Road Initiative is, the BRI, it is humanity's largest civilian cooperation project initiated by China's President Xi Jinping in 2013, in which China set off $1,000 billion. That is $1 trillion, if I'm correctly informed, to start an infrastructure project linking countries, roads, infrastructure, harbors, education, etc., and of course transport of goods and human beings, and a digital infrastructure to put the world together horizontally from China over to actually the old Silk Road. It's a new version of the old Silk Road, to Damascus and Aleppo and these places, down to Africa and over to South America. Everybody can participate. The only Western country that has is Italy, on a little corner, on a little project of the NATO countries. In Europe, it's basically Serbia, Budapest, and a few others. Long story short, this is the end of the free media in the United States of America. If you push through, it's not decided yet, it has not been passed. It's a proposal by Robert Menendez of the Democratic Party. If this goes through, up till 2026, $1.5 billion will be spent on propaganda, on teaching journalists to write negative stories about China. Now, I just asked you, how is that compatible with free media? If you add to that also CIA's influence, if you add to that the kind of, Operation Mockingbird from the early 50s that has gone on for all the time, if you add to that a number of media already state-financed in the United States, such as Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Asia, parentheses, which have come with many of the witnesses' stories about Xinjiang, if you add these things up, it's billions of dollars put into deceptive newsmaking on one country. How much will they spend on Iran, Russia, North Korea, Eastern Europe, maybe NATO allies they don't like? I mean, this is the end, as I said, of free media, free opinion formation, and that is thereby also the end of the fundamental basis of modern Western liberal democracy, because people will be totally uninformed about what the world will be. It will only be the American aspect on it. And I'm dismayed by this fact. I wonder how we would have reacted in the West if China had put up such a proposal or carried through such a proposal that the only purpose now, the main purpose that we finance is negative stories about the US. Whenever I talk with the Chinese, and I have quite a lot of dialogue with them on Zoom, etc., and listen to and read their media, there is a wish to cooperate. There is an emphasis of international law. There is a win-win attitude. There is come and do it together. And I say, and that's the last thing I'm going to say, the world cannot afford negative energy anymore. The world is in such a situation when it comes to environment, when it comes to militarism, when it comes to nuclear weapons, when it comes to poverty alleviation, when it comes to justice, when it comes to all the big problems humanity is facing that we have very short time to solve. We see a so-called leader of the world beginning to spend billions of dollars on destruction of the views of the world, which will prevent our coming together and solving these problems. This is a completely irresponsible policy, and it does not deserve the support of NATO allies or the European Union. But these guys obviously cannot wake up to what is happening in Washington, or they don't dare to do so. And that means that when the United States will fall, so will NATO and the European Union, if they don't wake up rather quickly.
It's a very eye-opening point. Or points, I should say, that you made regarding, the amount of money, the sheer amount of hundreds of millions, billions that are being spent in order to control the narrative. And so, one final question that I wanted to ask you is, you mentioned that a few decades ago, perhaps the media was much more open. You mentioned yourself that you were able to speak on mainstream media not even 20, 30 years ago. America was also intervening militarily back then as well. Their military intervention is, of course, not a recent phenomenon. So to what extent would you argue that America, perhaps realizing that they're losing grip of the world economically, for example, the relative decline of America or the rise of China, as you mentioned, do you think that realizing that they're losing their grip over these things, not relevant perhaps directly to the media, is why they realize that they have to now use this weapon in order to regain control? Or do you think those factors are not linked?
Well, I think that, as Peter also hinted a few moments ago, there is no opposition to it. They do it because it's possible. If you don't have conscious, well-educated professional journalists, or much fewer of them, who knows the local language when they go somewhere, who are stationed as reporters for 5 or 10 years in an environment, read the local newspapers, know what they talk about, and are freely invited to frequently talk about what they see and hear, let's say, in a conflict zone. You will, over time, end up having simply a number of, apparatchiks, extended hands of foreign ministries and State Department. It's nothing new. It is just that the cracks that existed in the wall before does not exist anymore. It's closed. I mean, I was among a handful of people from the West who were in Aleppo between the 10th and the 14th of December 2016, when, al-Nusra and all the others were sent running. It was a historic moment. It was a turning point. It was basically the end of that war. There was not one Western media who responded to our press infos at the time about this, me being there saying, I'm willing to tell you everything I've seen and heard. Now, when that happens, and when journalists are no longer intellectuals, but are, relatively low educated young people who is now called senior correspondents, at the age of 32 or something like that. And as I said, many of them not even having a master's. I mean, I think you shouldn't send anybody to China without an ability to know political theories of China. If you're used to report traffic accidents in London or New York, it is not the person to send to China and trying to understand probably the most complex and sophisticated civilization on earth. And this type of de-intellectualization, this kind of low level of education in the media serves the nanny state, as you called it, Peter, but also it serves warfare, because you have to have an intellectual opposition, be it the left wing or whatever, or the Social Democratic Party or whatever we are talking about in different political systems and countries. If you don't even have political parties who can say, hey, what's going on here? I have noticed that, for instance, when the Danish government decided to go to war for 4 years, in Iraq, and becoming an occupying power, the prime minister, who later on became the Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Anders Fogh Rasmussen, never got a question, what is going on here and why does Denmark go to war? But I, as a peace researcher, was interviewed at the time and say, hey, how do you think we can how can you be so naive? That was the implication of the question. How can you be so naive to think that we can deal with Saddam Hussein without intervening? I had to explain why I thought that peaceful negotiations or whatever, things like Hans Blix and others talked about, it would be a good idea. Whereas everybody said, well, warfare is the only way to go. And you see where we are today. In 2004, less than a year after the intervention, I wrote a book in Danish called Predictable Fiasco. Any idiot who'd been to Iraq and interviewed people could see that they were never going to succeed with that project. But I was the one who supposedly should defend why I thought peace and negotiations, mediation and UN procedures would be better than smashing up the country, killing millions of people and killing more people in sanctions than in warfare. And it's going on now with Iran also. It breaks my heart to see, working in Iran, how they're treating innocent people with these sanctions, these damn sanctions, which also are not talked about in the media, because it's just, lower level people, innocents in an authoritarian, theocratic state. I don't care what it is, it's human beings. And that is the important point. We should be ashamed of what we do to ordinary innocent citizens around the world. And the media who don't tell you about it should be even more ashamed than the politicians who do it, in my view.
Well, definitely the common theme that I've seen between the both of you is that both of you are, without a question, acknowledged, distinguished experts in your respective fields, and yet despite that are not...
Honors, yes.
Yes. And despite that are almost ignored, not almost, definitely ignored when it comes to speaking, being allowed to be given a space and a platform. And it's not as if both of you are turning down or refusing and only choosing to speak on one platform or another. Both of you have openly expressed the willingness to speak on any platform, on whichever platform invites you to speak. And once again, as you mentioned, it's not as if either of you are a lower level journalists or who don't have the credentials and just have an opinion. It is whatever both of you believe in and accept are backed by the facts which you presented in the correct scholarly fashion. But we would like to thank Dr. Jan Oberg for joining us on this for this conference panel today. It has been a huge honor and privilege to have you with us, and we are looking forward to welcome you on future shows.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure, and thanks for taking up these issues.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you. I'll come back to you, Peter. Would you like to give your reflections and thoughts of everything, of what you picked up from what he said? Of course, he came in from the angle of peace and conflict resolution and so on.
And I very much agree with what Jan said about the, let's call it the dumbing down of political reporting, the standard of political reporting, the quality of the reporters themselves, this dumbing down itself is part of a bigger picture because television news these days, what used to be called information, they now call it infotainment. Mm-hmm. Information and entertainment. You see, it's part of the infantilization theme, that everything now has to be entertaining. Mm-hmm. Never mind whether it's true or accurate or fair, as long as it's entertaining. This will entertaining in the sense of being eye-catching, mm-hmm. keeping the viewer viewing so that they see the television commercials. And that can often involve exaggerating violent scenes or violent narratives, mm-hmm. making things more exciting.
Yes.
Very rarely de-dramatizing a situation or trying to avoid escalation. Everything works in the direction of entertainment, and everything becomes like a video game.
Right.
Supremely violent. And again, a video game for children. And this is what news in the Western world has become today. It's violent news for children.
One thing that you pointed out as well is that there are organizations in the media who are, for example, pushing a narrative that maybe they're paid for or so on. But interestingly, you mentioned that there are also media outlets who perhaps maybe not intentionally or are not paid themselves to push that narrative, but they do so anyways, maybe out of fear of reprisal or so on. Tying in with the point that you mentioned about dramatization or sensationalization, do you think that inadvertently many organizations in a chase for media viewership or numbers, in the face of what they may believe as heavy competition from other media outlets, inadvertently push this, for example, this war of violent narrative because it gets them views, but at the same time is also what a foreign policy directive exactly wants?
That's exactly right. It's an explosive coming together of two forces, commercial forces with what governments want, with what the security, military complex want, which is usually conflict. It's a very dangerous chemical combination. And one result of it is that people who want to be objective or who have an alternative point of view get demonized themselves. I personally have been smeared by the BBC World Service. I think you've gathered I'm not a big fan of the BBC or the World Service, but it's just a small illustration of a wider point that the dissidents, alternative viewpoints, are not only silenced, but actively smeared and worked against, so that we stand no chance of putting an alternative viewpoint forward except in certain little corners of the internet.
Right. It is very interesting to analyze, as you said, the coming together of the two forces and so on. What do you feel about the billions of pounds or hundreds of millions of pounds they're being spent, in this case, on one country? Obviously that's controlling the narrative is one issue, but we're talking about spending hundreds of millions on a country that to a government is a perceived threat. Perceived threat. Well, one comment that Dr. Jan Oberg made was that America makes it, obviously, as you mentioned, dramatized all of these threats, but how many are there actually any genuine threats to American security? Because security is often what is quoted as. Do you not think as a result that the public, the American public, the British public have the right to know ultimately where their taxpayers' money is going towards? The fact that we have, for example, many critics will say underfunded welfare services, homelessness on the streets, so on. But because, as you said, of this infotainment, maybe reality television, all these distractions that keep the public away, do you feel that the British public and the American public have the right to know these things? And to what extent, all of these, I guess, narratives, or all this that's being done to stop them from seeing this?
Well, the public are being brainwashed on a daily basis. So that most of the British public is happy just to lap up the entertainment, spend more time on their video games and their Netflix, and leave it to the nanny state to worry about security. Frankly, the great British public, as we used to call it, no longer cares about freedom of expression, no longer cares about avoiding war. They trust the state to look after their security. So now Britain and other countries in the West have actually never been safer than they are today. They do not face any serious threat of any description from China or Russia, which has an economy the size of Italy's, China, which is struggling just to be accepted as an important player, Iran, which definitely doesn't threaten the West in any shape or form, Syria even less, and yet here we are being frightened to death by our government, told that we must be afraid of these countries, and brainwashed non-stop, 24 hours a day, by this infotainment complex, this unholy alliance of government, security agencies, military, media, and corrupted academe. The universities are part of this as well, pumping out propaganda, often literally paid for by governments. So this money for media itself is only part of the picture. There's also money for universities, the very dangerous and sinister think tanks, which is a contradiction in terms. It's a no think tank. You take the money and you say what the government wants you to say. We're living in dangerous times, very dangerous.
Very much so. I would like to bring in our next guest. Our next guest is Nadia Elina. She holds a master's degree in historical culturology. She studied at the Oberg State University, Masaryk University in Czech Republic. She is a blogger, online journalist, and has interests in 20th century history in Russia and former USSR countries, as well as in Eastern Europe. So we would like to welcome you on the show.
Hello. Thanks for the invitation.
Hi, good evening. I hope you are well.
Well.
We've been discussing on the show about throughout this conference about media expression and the geopolitical relations between different countries. You yourself, as someone coming from a Russian perspective, as a Russian journalist, what are your views and your comments about what you have faced as a Russian journalist when wanting to report in the media, and of course the impact on Russian TVs, Russian channels in presenting their views?
Well, I can tell impact on me on person, because I spend a lot of time on the internet, and I hear a lot when I start to express my opinion about any situation. I often hear from Western society something like, you're from Russia, you're brainwashed. It's just like that. Like my opinion means nothing because I'm from Russia. But and sometimes my posts banned for really weird things. Like, for example, once was banned post in my Facebook page about, there was information that one of the Russian writer was died, and it was banned. I don't know why. And also, there was once information about, I made a video about women who fought against the modsheheads, and it was banned too. So it's a big problem today in internet that we can be banned for normal videos, for normal information. I don't promote anything, let's say, criminal, but without explanation, we are banned, and that's a problem for us, for our area, I think.
Right. You mentioned one thing that we actually haven't, we didn't really talk about. We talked about many positives and negatives of social media, but one thing we actually hadn't discussed was social media now banning content, usually on the excuse of national security, on the basis of something being, as you mentioned, maybe inappropriate or violent or criminal, and so on. Have you noticed perhaps that such bans by social media are disproportionately affecting the work of Russian journalists, and that this banning is not perhaps affecting other journalists or those who maybe are tweeting other things?
Yes, but I heard, for example, that YouTube deleted channel about Crimea. Sometimes some Russian sources like Russia Today can face some bans, but I mean, for example, I don't think that Russia has very powerful propaganda, but we still banned, and it is really ridiculous. I mean, West just want to show us like want to create idea of foreign enemy, and that's how situation here.
What would you say is the motivation or the reason for the United States or others in the West for banning or censoring journalists such as yourself and others in Russia? What exactly is it, the threat that they claim that there is?
Well, because I think today world more or less in the crisis, so people don't trust a lot the government, they don't trust a lot media, and the oppositional media helps to promote this mistrust. So you need to stop it. And second, I think that you need to convince your followers that people who don't follow your agenda, it's not because you have problems in your country, economical, political, it's because someone outside like Russia or China fooled them, because it is difficult for West to admit that they have problems too, and they try to blame us. But as I said, it's ridiculous.
Very much so, in your opinion. Now, obviously, these actions have been taken, these actions are being carried out, as you mentioned, all the time, and in your words, are ridiculous. To what extent do you think that the blocking has has worked? Because obviously the intended purpose of blocking and censoring is to stop a narrative from being pushed. It's to stop another alternative view to be presented. Do you think that it has worked successfully, or do you think that despite these Russian journalists have managed to still present their opinions and still manage to get around it?
I think it will be much more difficult later, but there's only one way for people to fight for their right to express their opinion, and I think it will be a very long fight, but at the end I think we anyway will get our rights. At least I hope for it.
I suppose in this profession, when you are fighting for something, obviously it is important to maintain some hope and some momentum on that. I wanted to ask a quick question to Peter. She mentioned that very often it's the case that in an effort to distract the public from their own problems, I think we touched upon this earlier, they want to create an enemy out of someone else, demonize another country, another people who may not be of threat. Why is it important for a country to perhaps distract its own citizens from its own issues? Because obviously we talked about foreign policy directives in that they have their certain interests in other countries, and so they distract them not to notice that. Yeah. But why does a country which claims to be democratic, why would they not want their citizens to know, in fact, their own problems that they're facing themselves at home?
I think part of the reason is simple inertia. The fact that it's easier always to not change, just to carry on doing what you're comfortable with doing. And my country, Britain, has been comfortable for decades with demonizing first the Soviet Union, and then when the Soviet Union collapsed, we had a problem for a few years. We needed new enemies. Well, Islamist terrorists came along to fill the gap. But then when we defeated the Islamic State, we needed to go back to demonizing good old Russia, which has made the terrible mistake of defending its own interests in Eastern Europe, which is unforgivable. So a good part of it is simply just staying with what is familiar. Politicians find it much easier to defend the status quo than to suggest any change, especially in matters of national security. I'd just like to add that this demonization of Russia is pursued with great vigor by Hollywood. I happen to be watching on TV, because we see most films now on our television monitors, a fairly recent film called Red Sparrow, which in a technical way was a very good film, very watchable, very dramatic, interesting characters, a lot of action, but which ideologically was execrable, hateful. It demonized Russia in the most crude way imaginable. All the Russians, except the heroine, who went over to the West, all the other Russians were monsters, perverts. It was so crude, but Hollywood is a major player in the infotainment complex. Let's be honest, many people get their political views from watching films, from this constant propaganda pumped out by Hollywood.
It's a very interesting angle to look at, to look at the infotainment, the film industry, and how that plays a part in pushing a narrative, and it's not just simply the news. I do want to ask our guest are. If I wanted to ask our guest about cases of blackouts or censorship. I'm aware that you have an interest in history of the Soviet Union and Russia. Would you say that in the last 20, 30 years, such censorship and blocking has increased, or has it always been at a high level? And what would you say, if it just has been increasing, are the reasons and motivations why it's increasing now rather than before?
As I said, if we talk about West, I think it's because of the crisis. If we talk about Russia, no, I think we don't have a lot of censorship. I review our government more or less lazy in this case. So, but if West will start to suppress Russian media, I think they can do the same with Western media, I think.
Well, one thing that Peter mentioned was the influence of the film industry and movies on pushing a view or narrative and demonizing Russia and Russian citizens as well. Have you at all, in your experience as a journalist, a blogger and so on, in your travels perhaps, have you felt any of that sentiment, that there was an unwelcoming sentiment towards you just on the basis of being Russian?
Well, when I studied in Czech Republic, and if I meet someone from, should I continue?
Yes.
So if I meet someone liberal, of course, for them it was important if I'm Russian, like whatever I tell or do, for them it will be bad. And for example, they can tell that, in Czech Republic already a lot of people from former USSR countries, so why are you coming here? I just studied here and even paid for my education. I wasn't like some migrant or something like that. And regarding movies, I can tell that I think we are the main enemy, not even China, because we are politically correct enemy. We are, let's say, white. Already there is a policy from Cold War, so I think for USA it will be better to use us always as an enemy, not even China. And even from economical perspective, we have just 145 million and China's billion, so it will be much better to use us than to lose market of China and for USA and Europe.
It's a very interesting point, because as what you said of perhaps demonizing Russia as opposed to China because of perhaps China as a rising power, it's not something I guess that the UK would see that they want to mess with, and so they feel perhaps that Russia is easier to demonize. Do you feel, therefore, that as someone who is trying to remain hopeful that the situation will improve for journalists, under what circumstance would you say that, dare I say, the focus of the main enemy would shift away from Russia and perhaps to another country? Do you see such a circumstance?
Well, if conflict with West, between China and West will continue, I think that maybe West will have idea to take us on their side, maybe in this situation. But other than that, like Brzezinski always felt that we will be with West against China when USSR fall, but it didn't work for them.
Right. Mr. Peter Ford, what are your comments on what she has been sharing with us about the position of Russia as being I guess an easy target, I suppose, as being an enemy as opposed to China, and whether that would change? Because as you mentioned as well, in the last 20, 30 years, we've always had to have a new enemy to go to, and now it's Russia, for example. Where do you see that going next?
Well, I'm not optimistic. The Western powers are a little bit more careful with China because of China's economic clout. Russia is relatively easy to beat upon in economic terms. The cost to the Western economies of sanctioning Russia much lower than would be the cost of trying to sanction China. And this is a major reason why the Western countries demonize Russia as they do. But China is coming more and more into the crosshairs of the Western ideologues. Maybe focus on Russia will diminish in the coming years, and we'll see ever more focus on China. That seems more or less inevitable. I'd just like to mention that here in Britain there's another factor involved, that historically the British Labour Party has tended, being a socialist party, has tended to be, if not pro-Russian, then at least objective with regard to Russia, and not always enthusiastic about NATO. And for that reason, the Conservative Party have tried to attack Labour for being pro-Russian. This was an easy line of attack. But that situation has now changed today. It helped to explain how Jeremy Corbyn, the previous leader of the Labour Party, was brought down. He was personally demonized, particularly over his attitude towards Russia. His successor has learnt the lesson and has now become even further to the right in foreign policy terms than the Conservatives, even more anti-Russian. And this will also change the terms of debate in Britain. It will no longer reap the same political dividends to be anti-Russian as it did in the past.
Very much so. I would like to thank our guest Nadia Elina for joining us today. Thank you so much for.
Thank you for inviting.
Yes, and we hope to invite you in a future event. Thank you very much.
Okay, see you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting point. Well, a whole host of points about just the overall geopolitical landscape, and of course you mentioned the Labour Party and how easy it is to demonize Russia. We also do see that as well with regards to China as well, where someone could suggest something. Obviously, as you mentioned, the Labour Party historically is meant to be a more left-leaning socialist party, and very often it's been the case, as you mentioned, the case of the former leader Jeremy Corbyn in the past, where he may make a comment that is maybe hardly left-wing, but very easily can be demonized as something communist, for example, when it's perhaps nothing close to that. And part of that as well, we've also seen as a result the rise of this kind of cancel culture, where just as someone having a view that maybe, let's say, unpopular, is immediately shut down straight away, is not given any room or any space to have that opinion, and so perhaps afraid to give that opinion. What are your thoughts about this sort of cancel culture that has come around?
Yes, good point. Cancel culture, which is so prevalent on Western university campuses in the last few years, a really worrying tendency. And it's equivalent to banning TV stations or silencing dissidents by not giving them a platform in mainstream media, not giving them a platform in universities or whichever other institution we're talking about by cancelling them is just another aspect of this increasing intolerance of dissent or alternative views, and the insistence that there's only one correct opinion, whether it's on women's rights, on transgender, or Russia, or Syria, or whatever. It's a very noticeable and very alarming trend in Western societies. I think it was Jan who spoke earlier about the pravdafication of Western media. I would echo that and would also coin the phrase Chinafication of our societies. In the last year, our societies very consciously adopted the Chinese model for dealing with the pandemic. Our governments took actions which would have been considered unthinkable. Locking people up in their houses, curfews. We can only call this the Chinification of Western societies, and we're going to see a lot more of it. This is the paradox, that we think that we are the enemies, the adversaries of China, but actually China has gotten in like a virus into our own systems and is infecting our own democracy with its own behaviors, which I'm not going to criticize here, but they're different behaviors. They have a different level of tolerance for dissenting opinion. And whether we like it or not, we are adapting Chinese ways more and more, at the same time that we think we are opposing China. China's winning.
So I think throughout today we've had a lot of very much almost alarm bells that have been called by our panel of experts. I would like to bring in our final guest for today. Max Parry is an independent journalist and geopolitical analyst based in New York. His writing has been a feature in the Ends Review, the Center for Research Globalization, American Herald Tribune, and other independent publications, including the Greenville Post, where he served as associate editor. He is regularly featured in Sputnik News and Press TV as a commentator on domestic and world affairs. Max Parry, welcome to our conference panel today.
Thank you for having me. And first, let me extend my gratitude to Islamic Radio and Television Union for the invitation to speak. And I'm very honored to be on the same panel as Ambassador Ford and Dr. Oberg and Ms. Elina. So thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
It is our pleasure to host you. As someone who, I'm sure you've been listening to at least some of our conversation that we've been having, as someone who is based in the United States, we've spoken a lot about the position of the United States, the influence it tries to have. As someone who is a journalist and analyst based in the United States, what have you encountered in terms of presenting an alternate view, a narrative that is different to that that is pushed by the government, and what hurdles have you faced as a result?
Well, first of all, I'd be very naive to even pursue journalism thinking that I could challenge, the mainstream consensus or mainstream narrative without taking into account without assuming that I would be relegated to the margins in terms of where I can be published, where I can be featured, and even how much of a presence I can have on social media platforms, because we know for a fact that what goes viral or what starts trending on social media platforms is not determined simply based on as many might assume, by the number of shares or retweets or likes that things get, but these platforms are heavily curated. And as far as what information becomes popular, it's being filtered and curated by these platforms, which have an enormous conflict of interest and close proximity to the political establishment, the intelligence apparatus, and the military-industrial complex. So, just as a journalist in the United States, it's never even really occurred to me, to be honest with you, to try and have any kind of presence. But my options are certainly limited, just based on the fact that if you're going to be a journalist that holds the powerful to account and under scrutiny, or asks questions or challenges mainstream narratives, you're going to have a very limited range of options where you can be featured. And it's no coincidence that the very few places that have contacted me who've seen my work and have offered me a space to provide commentary on domestic affairs in the United States or foreign policy matters are foreign-based outlets like Press TV, or Sputnik News, both of which have been the subject of censorship. Press TV is in regards to as we've seen the tide of public opinion in the United States turn against the Zionists and their genocide of the Palestinians. Press TV is an outlet that is a courageous, truth-telling platform that, unlike you were saying earlier about Al Jazeera, which is owned by the ruling emirs of Qatar, tells the whole unfiltered truth about the Israel-Palestine issue, and gives a voice to the axis of resistance against the Zionists and the region and their greater Israel project. And Sputnik News, numerous Russian outlets have been the subject of censorship, especially following the 2016 election, where the intelligence community spread the lies and disinformation that Russia was interfered in the U.S. democratic process. So, just as an independent journalist, who is committed to muckraking, I obviously my limitations are there's great limitations where I can be featured, and it's just getting worse and worse. Even 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, when the Iraq War was launched, yes, the United States media, of course, sold the lies that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. But even at the time, there was at least, a few voices, like a Seymour Hersh, for example, pushing back against the Bush administration's propaganda. But now, even someone like Seymour Hersh, who's arguably widely regarded as the world's greatest living journalist, as Dr. Ford or Ambassador Ford certainly knows, after the allegations against the Syrian government of the use of chemical weapons, when Mr. Hersh published an article challenging that view, his writing was no longer welcome in the New Yorker or the London Review of Books. He had to get it published in a German newspaper. So it's just getting worse and worse here in the United States, and similarly in the UK, I'm sure. So just not that I'm comparing myself to Seymour Hersh, but as a journalist who is committed to telling the truth and challenging the status quo, it's where I can be published and where I can be featured is extremely narrow and relegated to the margins.
That's that really is the case. As you mentioned, that when you are challenging the narrative, it is important, as you said, not to be naive at the same time. It can be very easy, I suppose, to be naive when challenging a narrative that, you know, you wouldn't get sidelined, or you would get sidelined. You mentioned the Israel-Palestine, in the media described as, for example, a conflict, in a way to make it a two-sided affair, for example. Do you believe that the tide is perhaps turning in terms of the American public opinion of Palestine and Israel, seeing as usually the media in America seem to be very staunchly pushing the Israeli narrative, but we have seen in cities across the country in America that protests have been held to a scale that, to be honest, I don't think has been seen in America, the protests for Palestine. Do you feel that has given you hope that that the momentum is there, that the narrative is changing, and that people are challenging the mainstream narrative in ways that they didn't before?
In regards to that particular issue, I do think that the tide is turning. I wouldn't go as far as to say that the Palestinians are having their South Africa moment just yet, but I do believe that it's coming down the line, and I think that's why, in part, the Zionists are, you know, becoming increasingly desperate, and you know, are scrambling to, you know, prevent any kind of rapprochement between the U.S. and Iran, for example, undermining the re-entry into the JCPOA. And in regards to, you know, the Palestinians, they're choosing to go full throttle with their violence and ethnic cleansing, and you know, continuing the settlements and their genocidal assault on Gaza. So, just as an American citizen, I can tell you the tide of public opinion is definitely turning against the Israelis. I think it really started following 2014, and I think the process really accelerated, especially during the Trump administration, because you know, every U.S. administration, of course, has been has really you know, supported, provided out and out support for the Israelis. But under the Trump administration, you know, the policies were so you know, just in disregard of the rights. No one could maintain the perception that the U.S. was a neutral player in Israel-Palestine relations. I mean, declaring Jerusalem to be the undivided capital of Israel, and moving the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, or recognizing Judaism as a nationality. I mean, various foreign policy moves by the Trump administration, and, you know, the sort of toxicity of anything related to Trump, his out and out support for Israel, I think really kind of accelerated a process that was already going on, where, you know, the tide of public opinion, particularly within the Democratic Party, has been turning against the Israelis. And you know, they've fallen out of public favor, and I think that you know, that's why you see, for example, Facebook working very closely with the Israeli government to, you know, censor pro-Palestinian accounts and news outlets, and how, you know, they've been exerting control over content that exposes the truth about what's going on over there. And so, just speaking as a U.S. journalist, I have it's you couldn't not notice how the Israelis are indeed starting to lose the PR war And, even among young Republicans, the approval of Israel has started to go down in recent years. So I do think that there is a shift happening. And it's just getting harder and harder for mainstream media to put a spin on, when the Israelis are shooting journalists that are wearing vests that say "press" across their chest. It's just there's no possible way that they can continue to cover what the massacres that the Israelis are carrying out and propagandize Americans anymore without the truth getting out. And I think social media has also made it more and more difficult for them to do that. So I do believe, particularly within the Democratic Party and the younger generation, the tide is definitely turning against the Israelis, and that's why you see them becoming increasingly desperate and isolated because they realize that the Hasbara is no longer working as well.
It's definitely, as you mentioned, the tide that is turning, public opinion that is shifting. But one very interesting thing that Max mentioned, which I would like to ask Peter as well, is that in the past, we've seen, I'm sure in your experience in diplomacy as well, very often the foreign policy directives of a country are usually done perhaps behind closed doors. It's not blatant, it's not open. Those who know will see it, but it's not perhaps as vocal or direct as it was the case as President Trump, as Max mentioned, where it was no longer a case of hypocrisy. The motives, I guess, of what they wanted to do, they said it as it was. Do you feel that now not only the government, let's say, are losing grip of the media narrative, let's say, but they're also, to what extent, losing grip of their ability to do what they want to do without being caught, so to speak? And accountability, I suppose.
I regret to say that Western governments are becoming ever more adept, skillful, and successful at controlling the mainstream narrative. Not just on the Middle East, not just with regard to Russia and China and Iran, but on issues of what they themselves call biosecurity as well. We've seen this, and it's not even an open secret. They boast, Western governments, of spending hundreds of millions of dollars on propaganda and advertisements. I mean, regardless of whether you agree with the way the pandemic has been treated by Western governments, the fact is that you have been subject to a barrage of brainwashing paid for with your taxpayer money. Hundreds of millions of dollars have gone to newspapers and other media, and this is in fact one of the ways governments have exerted more control over the mainstream media. They have become, in the absence of many commercial advertisers, they've become the biggest funders of many newspapers simply with these advertisements in the last year. So I regret to say that we come out of this year with governments even more experienced, skillful, less ashamed of using manipulation openly. In Britain, we have a unit of government called the Behavioural Insight Team, which openly boasts of being able to manipulate public opinion. Where are we heading? Where are we heading? I think Trump was a very interesting phenomenon. He was definitely part of the entertainment. You woke up every day wondering what new adventure he got up to. He was like a sort of hero or anti-hero in a video game, with the difference that he started to take control of the narrative. He started to write his own program, which his programmers, the establishment, the security, military, media complex, didn't appreciate that he was writing his own program and coming out with heresies like, well, maybe good relations with Russia might be a nice thing. Oh no, shock, horror, we can't have that. And therefore he was undermined, not just by his own weaknesses and failings, but very deliberately by the deep state.
Right. Very interesting comments, for sure, about the American presidency, American politics over the past few years, and how internal state influences that perhaps the public doesn't see really does take control of the narrative. I do want to ask Max Parry, whilst he's with us, where do you see this going next in terms of your position as a independent journalist? Where do you see the next few years going in terms of media expression, media censorship? Do you see it perhaps just staying the way it is, getting worse, getting better? And in any of those scenarios, what steps, what can be done in order to mitigate any, perhaps any worsening situation?
Well, it's unfortunate, but in light of the most recent U.S. presidential election, I can't help but have a very grim outlook about the future in regards to freedom of the press, at least in the United States, because no matter what one's thoughts about the most recent election were, as far as the vote result, particularly since the riot at the U.S. Capitol in January, we've seen probably, to my knowledge, the most unprecedented wave of censorship and suppression of free speech that we've ever seen, where even at the time, the sitting head of state of the country had his social media completely removed in coordinated unison by the biggest social media platforms and these big tech monopolies. And so no matter what your thoughts are on the election itself and the legitimacy of the result, that move in particular to remove Trump from social media, and then also to have the press cutting away from his press conferences, it set a truly dangerous precedent, I think, where these Silicon Valley tech monopolies, which already had just a unparalleled the flow of information, are now being handed the keys to completely control what Americans see, hear, read, and if you look at the new administration, the transition team was basically a revolving door with Silicon Valley. You had executives from every single big information technology company represented, from Amazon to Apple and Microsoft, several of which have been since awarded with contracts to multi-million-dollar contracts to manage the cloud infrastructure of the Pentagon and the CIA. And so we're seeing not only a huge wave of mass censorship, but there's an increasing congealment between the intelligence apparatus and the military-industrial complex with these Silicon Valley tech monopolies, who are just being weaponized to serve the establishment. And whether the vote itself for Biden was legitimate or not, I don't think I haven't seen any direct evidence that it was actually tampered with, but there was a big expose in Time magazine of all places showing how in the lead up to the election there were all these preparatory stages, preparatory steps taken by corporate America and these big tech companies to ensure that what the outcome was. And it's getting into a real dangerous gray area here because, even though it's these social media platforms are the primary source of where people get their information, they're private companies. And so whether or not, the right to freedom of speech applies to them as far as the First Amendment goes, it's a gray area, and they, as private companies, are able to get away with choosing who they censor, what information they choose to restrict. And, when you have their interests aligning with the political establishment and, when they're financially in bed with the same companies that are the number one supplier for the Pentagon, where you have something, a monopoly, like, for example, with Amazon, where even though it's not given a disclaimer by the Washington Post at the top of their articles, they are owned by the same man the Washington Post is owned by the same man who owns Amazon, which is contracted by the Defense Department. And so in turn, the Washington Post is reporting on military and foreign policy related matters, and their masthead is full of lobbyists from the defense industry and the Arab monarchies and so on and so forth. You're just seeing increasing coordination and collaboration between the military-industrial complex and Silicon Valley, and I really think it's reached a zenith with this new administration, where it's just essentially Silicon Valley that's in power. And so, unfortunately, in light of that, I see censorship getting worse. And just during the first few months of the Biden administration, we've seen Press TV removed from YouTube and Facebook. We've seen numerous other outlets be censored. And as Peter was alluding to, any kind of dissent in regards to the pandemic, or I myself actually wrote an article for Medium.com, about the origins of the coronavirus, and was had my account entirely removed. I mean, that's just one example. So, unfortunately, I think that things are only going to continue to get worse. But I think it's going to backfire. I think it's really indicative of the decline in U.S. power economically and geopolitically abroad. And when an empire is in a state of decline, it starts suppressing any kind of dissenting voices and freedom of speech. So unfortunately, I think it's only going to get worse. And another example is the way that the Twitter and Facebook censored the Hunter Biden story by the New York Post. That was also truly unprecedented. I mean, the New York Post, I'm no fan of, but it's one of the when you have one of the oldest newspapers in the United States being censored by these companies over a story where not even the Biden campaign denied the authenticity of the emails, that's just a truly unprecedented step. And the same thing with the censorship of Trump's social media. I think we're entering a new dangerous territory as far as the suppression of free speech goes, and unfortunately, I think it's only going to get worse.
Thank you very much, Max, for that insightful analysis into the future of media censorship in the United States. I mean, overall, I think the theme that I've gauged from everyone is just the dangers of media censorship, the increased control of the state, the nanny state as well, as the phrase used by Peter here. And overall, it is a dangerous precedent that's being set for the future. And ultimately, as our experts have and our journalists have expressed and said, is that what's important for them is that they don't stop, they don't go silent, because that is ultimately, in their view, what the establishment wants, what the media wants, the mainstream media. And as long as they continue, as long as they speak, they will continue to fight for pushing their view, their side of the story, their perspective and their angle, so long as they are able to. Max, if you're just able to stay with us as well, I wanted to thank both of you as well as our other guests who joined us for today's very insightful and exceptional conference program. Just on behalf of IRTVU, we wanted to present just a very small token of appreciation on behalf of IRTVU, IRTVU, the Islamic Radio Television Union. It's just an art piece from Iran, I believe, the Middle East, that they wanted to present to you on behalf of IRTVU. We thank you so much.
Thank you. That's beautiful. I'm honoured and very pleased. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Max, for joining us as well.
Well earned, Peter.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Peter, for joining us on the show. Thank you to everyone, to all our viewers for watching and tuning into today's conference. We hope you were able to take some lessons away. Hopefully, learn something from our experts, and we hope to welcome you for our next event. Thank you very much for watching. Good night and goodbye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.